There are moments when silence is louder than any alarm, and that was the exact moment Sergeant Daniel Reed realized the dog was not going to move. It was just past 5:42 a.m. in the industrial outskirts of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the air carried a damp weight of river fog and rusted steel, clinging to every surface like a memory that refused to fade. The old warehouse district had long been abandoned by commerce, but not by secrets. Rows of corrugated metal buildings standing like hollowed-out shells under a pale, washed-out sky. Floodlights buzzed weakly above cracked asphalt, casting trembling halos of light that flickered with the wind coming off the Mississippi River less than 2 miles away. Sergeant Daniel Reed stood at the edge of one such warehouse, his boots planted firmly on gravel that had not been touched in days, his posture still and controlled in the way only years of military discipline could teach. Beside him was K9 Titan, a German shepherd with a sable coat and a gaze that never seemed to rest on anything without purpose. Titan was not pacing like he usually did during routine inspections. He was locked in place, body angled toward the massive rusted sliding door of the warehouse, as if the world beyond it had called his name in a language only he could understand. Daniel followed his line of sight, adjusting his grip on the leash instinctively, even though Titan was not pulling away, not retreating, but resisting something unseen. The mission had been described as routine, a standard verification sweep requested after a contractor flagged irregular power usage in the district. No alarms, no confirmed threats, just procedure. But procedures never accounted for the way Titan's ears had shifted the moment they exited the vehicle, or the way his breathing had changed from steady to measured focus, as if every molecule in the air had suddenly gained meaning. Dr. Emily Carter, the civilian veterinary liaison assigned to K9 units in the region, stood a few feet behind them holding a small diagnostic kit, her eyes scanning Titan with a quiet concern that came from years of observing animals that sensed what humans could not. She had worked with military dogs long enough to know the difference between curiosity and certainty, and what she saw now was not curiosity. Titan stepped forward 1 inch, then stopped, his front paw hovering briefly before settling back onto the gravel, as if the ground itself had become a boundary he refused to cross. The warehouse door loomed ahead, its surface streaked with layers of oxidation, paint peeled back like old skin revealing metal beneath that had not been maintained in years. Yet Titan's attention was not on decay or structure. It was fixed on the seam where the door met the ground, a narrow dark line that disappeared into shadow. Daniel crouched slightly, lowering his voice in the calm tone he used during uncertain situations. "Easy, Titan," he said, though there was nothing to calm in the dog's posture that suggested panic. Instead, there was restraint, a kind of controlled intensity that made the surrounding air feel heavier. A passing contractor on site, a man in his late 40s wearing a reflective vest and carrying a clipboard, glanced over with mild irritation, insisting the building had been cleared days ago and that nothing inside warranted attention beyond structural inspection. But Titan did not respond to human confidence. He responded only to what he could sense beneath it. A faint metallic creak rolled through the warehouse frame as the wind pressed against it. And in that moment Titan shifted again, this time lowering his head until his nose hovered just inches above the ground, inhaling slowly, deliberately, as if reading something written there that no one else could see. Daniel exchanged a look with Dr. Carter, who gave a subtle shake of her head that meant she trusted the dog more than the paperwork. The atmosphere tightened, not with action, but with anticipation, the kind that forms right before something hidden decides whether it will remain hidden or finally reveal itself. Titan let out a low, restrained sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something closer to a warning carried on breath alone. Then he stepped directly in front of the warehouse door and stopped completely, positioning himself between the entrance and the team behind him as if he had made a decision that required no approval. Daniel straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the dog's stance. It was not aggression. It was obstruction. Intentional. Protective. Certain. And in that stillness, with fog curling around the edges of rusted metal and the faint hum of distant machinery echoing through the empty district, Sergeant Daniel Reed understood with quiet certainty that whatever was behind that door was not something Titan intended to let them approach without warning. The silence that followed felt heavier than the fog itself, as Sergeant Daniel Reed remained fixed in place, studying the German shepherd that refused to yield even a single inch of ground. Titan's body was still, but it was not relaxed, every muscle aligned as if he had drawn an invisible boundary in front of the rusted warehouse door and decided that nothing on the other side was permitted to pass without his awareness. The morning air in the industrial district of Baton Rouge seemed to tighten around them, carrying the faint scent of wet metal and river moisture that clung to everything like an old memory refusing to be forgotten. Dr. Emily Carter slowly stepped closer, her boots making soft contact with the gravel, her gaze alternating between Titan's fixed posture and the seam of the warehouse entrance. She had seen alert behavior before. She had seen stress responses and curiosity, but what she was witnessing now carried a different quality, something closer to conviction than instinct. The contractor on site shifted his weight impatiently, glancing at his watch and insisting again that the building had been cleared for inspection and that any further delay would be unnecessary, his tone carefully controlled but edged with irritation that suggested inconvenience rather than concern. Daniel did not respond immediately, his attention still anchored on Titan, who had now lowered his head slightly and was inhaling in slow, deliberate intervals, as if the air itself contained layers of information that required careful interpretation. A faint metallic echo rolled through the structure as wind pressed against the rusted panels, creating a subtle rhythm that sounded almost like distant machinery operating where nothing should be operating at all. Daniel raised his hand slightly, signaling the contractor to remain still, a gesture that did not accuse but instructed caution, and in that moment Titan shifted again, stepping laterally to block the exact center of the doorway, as if adjusting to a changing threat pattern only he could perceive. Dr. Carter knelt slightly, not touching the dog but observing his posture at eye level, noting the tension in his shoulders and the unwavering direction of his gaze, which never left the seam where the door met the ground. There was something there, she said quietly, her voice calm but firm, not as a statement of fear, but as an observation shaped by experience. Daniel exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation, trained to rely on procedure but never ignoring the behavior of AK-9 that had served through environments where human perception often failed. The contractor took a step forward, attempting to regain control of the situation, explaining that interior conditions were likely nothing more than humidity buildup and old equipment storage. But Titan responded instantly by shifting his stance, not aggressively but decisively, reinforcing his position as a barrier between the door and everyone else. The movement caused the contractor to pause mid-sentence, the confidence in his voice faltering for the first time as uncertainty replaced irritation. Daniel noticed it immediately, the subtle change in tone that often appears when certainty begins to erode. He looked down at Titan and spoke in a low, steady voice, giving a command for reassurance rather than control, but the dog did not relax, instead lifting his head slightly and focusing harder on the interior space beyond the door, as if something inside had just moved or shifted position. The air around them felt static, charged with anticipation that had no visible source but carried undeniable weight. Dr. Carter adjusted her grip on her medical kit and stepped slightly to the side, trying to align her perspective with Titan's line of sight, but all she could see was darkness through the narrow gaps of the rusted structure. A faint sound emerged then, almost imperceptible, not mechanical and not natural, but rhythmic in a way that suggested controlled activity within the space, causing Titan's ears to twitch sharply before returning to a fixed forward position. Daniel raised his hand again, this time signaling the team vehicle behind them to remain stationary, and for the first time the environment felt less like a routine inspection and more like a threshold moment where observation was no longer sufficient. Titan took one slow step forward, placing himself directly in front of the door seam again, and then stopped, his entire body aligned as if awaiting a decision that only humans could authorize but only he could validate. The contractor opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, now visibly unsettled, as if realizing that whatever explanation he had prepared no longer matched the behavior unfolding in front of him. Daniel's expression remained controlled, but his focus had sharpened, the way it always did when a situation transitioned from procedural to uncertain. He looked at Dr. Carter, who gave a subtle nod that indicated agreement without words, and then he looked back at Titan, who had not moved, not even slightly, as if time itself had narrowed to the space between breath and decision. The rusted warehouse door stood unchanged, yet everything about it now felt different, as if its silence had begun to carry weight of its own. And in that stillness, Daniel Reed understood that whatever lay beyond it was not simply hidden, but actively being guarded by the only member of their team who had no need for confirmation to know that something important was waiting just out of sight. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected, as the rusted warehouse door remained still and unresponsive, yet everything around it felt increasingly unstable, like the air itself had begun to shift its meaning. Sergeant Daniel Reed kept his position just behind Titan, his stance firm but no longer purely procedural, because what had started as a routine inspection had now become something shaped by instinct and hesitation. Titan stood motionless at the threshold, his head slightly lowered, ears angled forward, and eyes locked into the narrow seam of darkness where the door met the ground. There was no barking, no sudden movement, only a sustained focus that felt heavier than sound. Dr. Emily Carter remained a few steps back, her attention alternating between Titan and the warehouse entrance, her expression calm, but sharpened by the realization that whatever was happening here could not be explained by standard protocol alone. The contractor on site shifted again, now less vocal than before, his earlier frustration replaced by uncertainty as he glanced at Daniel, then at Titan, then back at the sealed structure as if reconsidering every assumption he had arrived with. A faint mechanical creak echoed from within the warehouse again, subtle enough that it could have been dismissed as wind pressure against aging steel, yet Titan reacted instantly, his posture tightening without advancing, as if acknowledging a change in condition that required full attention but not immediate action. Daniel slowly raised his hand, signaling silence to everyone present, and the surrounding district seemed to comply, as even the distant industrial hum faded into a muted background presence. The fog drifting through the loading area thickened slightly, rolling low across the gravel and pooling near the base of the warehouse door, softening the edges of visibility and creating the impression that the building itself was partially disappearing and reappearing with each shifting breeze. Titan stepped one deliberate pace to the left, aligning himself more directly with the center seam of the door, and then paused again, his body language communicating a clear refusal to disengage. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, narrowing her focus on Titan's breathing pattern, noting that it had become slower and more deliberate, as if he were synchronizing himself with something happening inside rather than reacting to something external. The contractor cleared his throat, attempting once more to assert that there was no scheduled activity or authorized personnel inside the warehouse. But his words lost strength halfway through, fading into the air as attention remained fixed on Titan's unyielding stance. Daniel finally spoke in a controlled voice, asking for confirmation of last known access to the building, and the contractor hesitated before responding, stating that a maintenance crew had reportedly passed through several days earlier, but offering no further detail. That small uncertainty lingered heavily, because it did not confirm safety. It only expanded the space for doubt. Titan suddenly lifted his head slightly higher, nostrils flaring as he drew in a deeper breath, and for the first time his tail shifted once in a restrained motion that did not indicate excitement, but recognition. The change was immediate and subtle, yet everyone present felt it at once, like the environment had tilted by a fraction of an inch. Daniel followed Titan's gaze and focused on the seam of the door again, noticing for the first time that faint scuff marks were visible along the lower edge, as if something or someone had interacted with it recently, though no clear explanation presented itself. Dr. Carter adjusted her stance again, now clearly aligned with Titan's perspective, and her voice dropped to a near whisper as she noted that his alert pattern suggested containment awareness rather than simple detection. The contractor opened his mouth as if to respond, but stopped, visibly unsettled, as Titan took a slow step forward and placed his front paw directly against the base of the door, not pushing, not pulling, but establishing contact as if confirming presence beyond it. A long moment passed in which no one spoke, no one moved, and even the wind seemed to lose momentum, leaving only the faint creaking of metal and the steady presence of the dog who refused to disengage. Daniel exhaled slowly, his decision forming not from instruction but from observation, and he raised his hand once more, signaling readiness to proceed with controlled entry protocol. Titan did not react to the command itself, but he did not move away either, maintaining his position as if acknowledging that the next step belonged to the humans, while his role was already defined. The warehouse door remained closed, unchanged, and yet it no longer felt like an ordinary barrier, because now it carried the weight of something being actively held back. And in that charged silence, Sergeant Daniel Reed understood that what Titan was guarding was not just a space, but a truth that had been waiting long enough to finally be discovered. The decision to proceed settled over the team like a quiet weight rather than a spoken command, as Sergeant Daniel Reed held his position beside Titan, feeling the tension in the air shift from observation to action. The fog around the warehouse had grown slightly denser, curling low across the gravel like slow-moving breath, and the rusted structure ahead no longer felt like a passive object, but like a sealed container holding something unresolved. Dr. Emily Carter stepped back half a step to clear the immediate entry zone, her eyes still fixed on Titan, whose entire body remained oriented toward the lower seam of the door. The contractor stood farther to the side now, arms partially lowered, his earlier insistence replaced by uneasy silence as he watched the Marine unit transition into controlled entry protocol. Daniel raised his hand and signaled the second team vehicle to hold position, then gave a short, precise gesture that initiated preparation for manual inspection of the entrance. Titan did not move away. Instead, he adjusted slightly, shifting his weight so that he remained directly aligned with the point where the door met the ground, as if anchoring himself to it. The metal surface in front of him showed faint signs of wear beyond age, subtle irregularities that suggested it had been disturbed more recently than the official report indicated. Daniel noticed this detail but did not speak it aloud, instead focusing on Titan's breathing, which had become steady but intensely focused, as though he were maintaining synchronization with something beyond the visible structure. Dr. Carter's voice remained low when she noted that Titan's posture suggested sustained alert containment behavior rather than reactive threat response, a distinction that often indicated something concealed rather than something approaching. The contractor finally spoke again, attempting to clarify that any previous access had been limited to authorized maintenance, but his tone lacked certainty, and even he seemed aware that his statement did not fully align with the situation unfolding in front of him. Daniel stepped forward carefully, positioning himself slightly behind Titan, maintaining a respectful distance while still preparing for direct engagement with the entrance. The fog shifted again, thinning momentarily near the base of the warehouse, revealing a narrow line where the door met the concrete foundation. Titan's nose lowered toward that line again, and he inhaled slowly, deliberately, then paused, holding still as if confirming something that had not changed since the moment they arrived. For a brief instant, everything was quiet enough that even the distant hum of industrial activity faded into near silence. Daniel gave a subtle hand signal, and one of the support officers moved into position with a standard inspection tool designed for manual door assessment. But before any contact was made, Titan stepped directly in front of the seam once more, not aggressively but decisively, placing himself in a position that blocked any immediate attempt to open the door. The action was precise, controlled, and unmistakably intentional. Dr. Carter observed the shift closely, noting that Titan's focus was no longer scanning or sampling, but fixed entirely on a single point beneath the door, as if awaiting confirmation from within rather than reacting to anything outside. Daniel lowered his gaze to the dog and spoke in a calm, steady tone, not issuing a command but acknowledging presence, and Titan responded only by maintaining his stance, unwavering and aligned with the threshold. The contractor took a cautious step backward, visibly uncertain now, as if realizing that the dog's behavior carried a level of certainty that paperwork could not override. A faint vibration passed through the warehouse frame, subtle enough to be dismissed as wind pressure against aging metal, yet Titan reacted instantly with a slight shift of weight, reinforcing his position without advancing. Daniel raised his hand again, signaling full halt of movement, and the surrounding team froze in place, their attention fully absorbed by the interaction between dog and structure. The fog thickened once more at ground level, briefly obscuring the seam, then drifting aside again as if revealing and concealing the same detail in slow rhythm. Titan remained perfectly still during this interval, his posture unchanged, but his focus intensified in a way that suggested recognition rather than discovery. Dr. Carter finally spoke again, her voice almost inaudible, suggesting that whatever Titan was detecting was not fluctuating, but persistent, as if something had been present long enough to establish a pattern. Daniel absorbed that observation without reaction, his attention locked on the door and the dog who refused to yield it. The entire scene felt suspended, not moving forward yet no longer able to remain still, as if the next action would define everything that followed. Titan did not look at Daniel, did not look at the contractor, and did not look away from the warehouse seam, maintaining absolute focus as the moment stretched into a silence so complete that even breath felt like a decision. And in that silence, Sergeant Daniel Reed made the final assessment that what stood behind the rusted door was not simply unknown, but intentionally concealed, and the only reason they had not yet crossed the threshold was because the one member of their team, without words, had already decided that something inside required them to stop. The stillness inside the industrial yard had become almost unnatural, as if the entire environment had paused in anticipation of a decision that no one was yet willing to make. Sergeant Daniel Reed stood just behind Titan, his posture steady but increasingly focused, his eyes moving between the rusted warehouse door and the German shepherd who refused to disengage from it. The fog continued to drift low across the gravel, thinning and thickening in slow, irregular waves that made the boundary between ground and structure feel uncertain. Dr. Emily Carter remained slightly to the rear, observing Titan's body language with a clinical attention that carried both caution and respect, while the contractor lingered farther back now, his earlier confidence replaced with a quiet unease that no longer needed words to be expressed. Titan remained in place, his front paws firmly planted near the seam of the door, his head lowered just enough that his nose hovered close to the narrow gap where metal met concrete. His breathing was slow, measured, and consistent, as if he were maintaining a mental map of something hidden beyond the barrier. Daniel shifted his stance slightly, not breaking focus, but recalibrating his position to align with the dog's perspective, and for the first time he allowed himself to consider that this was no longer a question of protocol, but of judgment. A faint metallic resonance rolled through the structure again, subtle enough that it could be dismissed as aging material reacting to wind, yet Titan responded immediately, not with aggression, but with a controlled tightening of his posture, signaling recognition rather than surprise. Dr. Carter spoke quietly, noting that sustained alert behavior without fluctuation often indicated a fixed stimulus rather than environmental noise, and Daniel absorbed that observation without interruption. The contractor attempted once more to clarify access history, mentioning that the building had been under limited maintenance review, but his words lacked precision, and even he seemed aware that his explanation was incomplete. Daniel raised one hand, signaling absolute silence, and the team obeyed instantly, allowing the soundscape to collapse into near total quiet. In that silence, Titan made a small adjustment, shifting his weight from one front paw to the other, maintaining contact with the threshold as if ensuring nothing inside could shift without his awareness. The fog curled again at ground level, briefly obscuring the seam before drifting away, revealing the same narrow line of separation between interior and exterior space. Daniel's attention narrowed further as he observed faint inconsistencies along the lower edge of the door, subtle signs that suggested recent interaction rather than long-term abandonment, though nothing definitive could be confirmed without entry. Dr. Carter knelt slightly again, studying Titan's facial expression, noting the way his eyes remained fixed and unblinking, not scanning for movement, but holding steady as if tracking something constant and unchanging. The contractor shifted his position once more, now visibly uncertain, glancing between the dog and the warehouse as if reconsidering whether his earlier assumptions were still valid. Titan suddenly lifted his head a few inches, nostrils flaring slightly as he drew in a deeper breath, and the change was immediate in its effect, not dramatic but precise, as if a single detail in the environment had shifted its meaning. Daniel noticed it instantly and tightened his focus, waiting for confirmation that did not come in words, but in posture. Titan remained still for a moment, then subtly adjusted his stance again, positioning himself even more directly in front of the seam, reinforcing the boundary he had already established. The surrounding team remained frozen, their attention fully anchored on the interaction unfolding between animal instinct and human uncertainty. Dr. Carter's voice dropped to near silence as she suggested that Titan was not reacting to random stimuli, but maintaining continuous awareness of a specific internal condition, something consistent and deliberate rather than intermittent. Daniel did not respond immediately, his mind processing the implications while his body remained steady, trained to act only when certainty outweighed hesitation. The fog shifted once more, revealing a slightly clearer view of the warehouse surface. And for a brief moment, the entire structure felt exposed, as if its concealment depended entirely on environmental obscurity. Titan did not move during that interval, but his presence felt increasingly assertive, not aggressive, but definitive, as though he had completed all necessary evaluation and now awaited human alignment with his conclusion. Daniel finally exhaled slowly, not as relief, but as acceptance of complexity, and he gave a subtle signal indicating that preparation for controlled entry should be maintained at readiness level. Titan did not react to the instruction because his attention never left the seam of the door, and in that unwavering focus the entire team understood that whatever lay beyond the rusted barrier was not a matter of speculation anymore, but a reality already acknowledged by the one member of the unit who did not require proof to recognize it. The atmosphere around the warehouse had shifted into something heavier, not because anything visible had changed, but because every person present now understood they were no longer dealing with a routine inspection. Sergeant Daniel Reed stood in a fixed position just behind Titan, his attention fully synchronized with the dog's unwavering focus on the rusted seam of the door. The fog continued to move in slow, uneven currents across the gravel lot, occasionally revealing and concealing the lower edge of the structure as if the environment itself was uncertain about what it was allowed to show. Dr. Emily Carter remained slightly offset to Daniel's left, her posture steady, but her eyes now reflecting a deeper level of analysis, as she studied Titan's behavior with a precision that suggested she was documenting something outside normal operational patterns. The contractor had moved farther back again, now standing near the perimeter of the yard, no longer speaking, his earlier confidence replaced by a silent observation that lacked any remaining certainty. Titan had not changed position for several minutes, but his stillness was no longer passive. It was controlled, deliberate, and anchored to a single point of awareness beneath the warehouse door. His breathing remained slow and measured, but there was a subtle shift in rhythm, as if he was tracking something that required sustained attention rather than immediate reaction. Daniel slowly adjusted his stance, maintaining visual alignment with Titan's line of sight, and for the first time he noticed faint irregularities in the ground near the base of the structure, subtle disturbances in gravel placement that suggested recent mechanical interaction rather than long-term abandonment. Dr. Carter spoke softly, her voice almost absorbed by the fog, noting that Titan's posture indicated continuous confirmation behavior, a state where AK-9 does not simply detect and react, but maintains verification of a persistent condition. Daniel did not respond immediately, his focus narrowing further as he processed the implication that whatever Titan was sensing was not new, but ongoing. A faint metallic vibration passed through the warehouse frame again, barely perceptible, yet Titan reacted instantly, with a slight tightening of his stance, reinforcing his position without advancing or retreating. The surrounding silence deepened, as if even the distant industrial background noise had diminished in response to the tension at the threshold. The contractor shifted his weight uneasily, glancing toward Daniel, as if expecting instruction that would release him from the uncertainty of waiting, but no such instruction came. Titan's attention remained fixed on the same narrow seam where metal met concrete, and now his entire body seemed calibrated to that single line of separation. Daniel raised a hand slightly, signaling continued hold, and the team maintained their positions without movement, allowing the moment to extend further into controlled stillness. The fog thickened briefly again at ground level, then thinned, revealing a clearer view of the warehouse base, where faint marks along the lower edge suggested repeated contact points, though their origin remained unclear. Dr. Carter stepped slightly forward, still maintaining safe distance, and observed that Titan's ears had shifted forward incrementally, not in response to sound, but as if aligning with a consistent internal cue. Daniel's expression remained composed, but his awareness sharpened further, recognizing that Titan was not escalating, but sustaining a level of certainty that required no adjustment. A second subtle vibration passed through the structure, and this time Titan's response was immediate but contained, a slight forward lean that reinforced his position at the seam without crossing it. The distinction was precise, as if he was drawing a boundary that could not be violated without consequence. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind transitioning from evaluation to preparation, and he subtly repositioned his footing to maintain direct readiness alignment with the door. The contractor looked down briefly, then away, no longer attempting to assert control over the situation. Dr. Carter's voice lowered further as she suggested that Titan's continuous fixation implied not a transient detection, but a stable and unresolved condition within the structure itself. Daniel absorbed the observation without verbal response, his focus now entirely locked on the interaction between dog and door. Titan remained unmoving for several seconds, then made a minimal adjustment of his front paw, pressing it slightly closer to the seam as if reaffirming contact with a boundary that mattered more than physical barriers alone. The fog shifted again, revealing the full lower edge of the door, and in that brief clarity the entire warehouse appeared less like an abandoned structure and more like a sealed environment holding its own silent status. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the wind seemed reduced to a faint presence at the edge of perception. Titan maintained absolute focus, and in that sustained stillness Daniel Reed understood with final certainty that whatever lay behind the rusted barrier was not waiting to be discovered, but waiting to be acknowledged. The controlled silence outside the warehouse had become so complete that it no longer felt like absence of sound, but rather the presence of something waiting to be acknowledged. Sergeant Daniel Reed stood fully aligned behind Titan now, his attention no longer divided between protocol and observation, but fully absorbed by the German shepherd's unbroken fixation on the rusted seam of the door. The fog had shifted again across the gravel lot, thinning in slow, uneven waves that briefly exposed the foundation line of the structure before covering it once more, as if the environment itself was breathing around the building. Dr. Emily Carter remained in a steady position a few feet to Daniel's left, her posture unchanged, but her focus now sharpened into continuous evaluation, carefully tracking Titan's stillness as something active rather than passive. The contractor had withdrawn farther toward the outer edge of the yard, his stance no longer assertive, his earlier insistence replaced by a quiet uncertainty that no longer attempted to influence the situation. Titan had not moved from the threshold, but his presence had become more defined with time, as though each passing second reinforced his decision to remain exactly where he was. His head was slightly lowered, his ears angled forward, and his breathing steady, yet every element of his posture communicated sustained awareness of something fixed beyond the rusted barrier. Daniel adjusted his position subtly, maintaining visual alignment with Titan while also preparing for controlled engagement if required, though no immediate action had yet been initiated. A faint vibration passed through the warehouse frame again, subtle and low, like pressure moving through old metal that had long been exposed to environmental stress. Titan responded instantly with a minimal shift forward, not crossing the boundary, but reaffirming his contact point with the ground just beneath the door's seam, as if anchoring himself more firmly to the exact location of concern. Dr. Carter spoke in a controlled whisper, noting that Titan's behavior indicated continuous verification rather than reactive detection, a condition where the subject maintains sustained confirmation of an unresolved internal stimulus. Daniel did not respond verbally, his attention narrowing further as he considered the implications of prolonged alert stability in AK-9 operating without fluctuation. The fog thickened briefly again, rolling low across Titan's legs before lifting just enough to reveal faint irregularities along the base of the door, marks that suggested repeated interaction with the structure in recent time. Though no clear origin, could be identified. The contractor shifted his weight once more, now silent and observant, his earlier attempts to influence interpretation completely abandoned. Titan's focus remained absolute, and there was now a subtle change in his stillness, not in movement, but in intensity, as though he had reached a point of final confirmation. Daniel raised a hand slightly, signaling continued hold and readiness status, and the team maintained their positions without deviation. The surrounding environment seemed to respond to the stillness, as even distant industrial noise faded into near inaudibility, leaving only the faint sound of wind moving across metal and gravel. Dr. Carter stepped slightly forward again, careful to maintain distance, and observed that Titan's posture had become increasingly anchored, his body aligned in perfect continuity with the seam of the door, as if marking a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. Daniel exhaled slowly, his internal assessment shifting from uncertainty to structured anticipation, recognizing that the situation had stabilized into a state of sustained threshold awareness. Another faint vibration passed through the warehouse structure, and Titan reacted immediately, not with escalation, but with precise reaffirmation of position, reinforcing his stance without breaking alignment. The fog parted once more at ground level, revealing the full lower edge of the door, and for a brief moment the structure appeared entirely exposed, its surface detail more visible than before, showing subtle signs of interaction that suggested recent presence within or behind it. No one spoke. No one moved. The moment extended into a prolonged silence that felt no longer temporary but definitive, as if the environment itself had accepted a fixed condition. Titan remained perfectly still, his focus unchanged, and in that unwavering presence Daniel Reed understood that whatever lay behind the rusted barrier was not simply hidden or forgotten, but actively contained within a reality that had already been sensed, confirmed, and silently marked by the one member of the team who never needed permission to know when something was there. The moment before action stretched into a form of silence so precise that it felt almost structured, as if the entire environment had settled into a single shared understanding of what was about to happen. Sergeant Daniel Reed stood fully ready now, his position aligned behind Titan, his focus no longer shifting between variables but locked into a single point of decision. The fog had thinned slightly across the warehouse lot, revealing the full lower edge of the rusted door with unsettling clarity, as if the atmosphere itself had chosen to stop concealing what it had been partially hiding. Dr. Emily Carter remained steady a few feet to the left, her posture controlled, her attention still fixed on Titan, whose entire body had become a sustained expression of absolute certainty. The contractor had stopped moving altogether, now observing in silence, his earlier confidence completely replaced by the awareness that this situation was no longer procedural but unresolved in a way that could not be ignored. Titan did not shift his position. Instead, he maintained perfect alignment with the seam of the door, his head slightly lowered, ears forward, and breathing steady, as though maintaining a continuous connection with something beyond the barrier. Daniel slowly raised his hand, signaling final preparation status, and the team behind him responded without hesitation, maintaining strict readiness while preserving silence. A faint metallic vibration passed through the warehouse again, but this time it was followed by something different, a subtle internal echo that seemed to travel through the structure rather than across it. Titan reacted instantly, not with movement toward or away, but with a controlled tightening of posture that suggested confirmation rather than alert. Dr. Carter observed this shift carefully and noted in a low voice that Titan's behavior had transitioned from sustained alert to final verification state, a condition often seen when a K9 has completed all possible sensory evaluation and is awaiting human confirmation of what it has already established internally. Daniel absorbed the observation without breaking focus, his attention now fully committed to the threshold in front of them. The fog drifted once more, thinner now, and for the first time the lower seam of the door appeared completely unobstructed, revealing subtle unevenness along the base that suggested repeated interaction points over time, though no clear explanation could yet be confirmed. The contractor took a small step backward, then stopped, his body language now entirely passive, as if he had relinquished any remaining expectation of control over the situation. Titan remained still, but his stillness had changed in quality, no longer simply maintaining position, but holding it with the precision of final decision. Daniel lowered his hand slightly, signaling readiness for controlled entry, and the team behind him adjusted accordingly, maintaining strict formation without verbal communication. The environment around them seemed to compress into silence, with even distant industrial noise fading into near-complete absence, leaving only the faint sound of wind moving through rusted metal edges. Dr. Carter stepped slightly closer again, carefully observing Titan's facial expression, noting that his eyes were no longer scanning or tracking, but fixed with unwavering stability, as if the uncertainty phase had already passed. Daniel's focus sharpened further, his internal assessment now fully aligned with the understanding that whatever lay behind the door was not in question anymore, only in containment. A final faint vibration passed through the structure, subtle but distinct, and Titan responded with a minimal forward lean, reinforcing his position at the exact center of the seam without crossing it. The gesture was precise, controlled, and absolute, as if marking the exact point where action would transition from observation to consequence. Daniel held his position for one more moment, allowing the silence to fully settle around them. And in that silence there was no longer hesitation, only alignment between instinct and procedure. The warehouse stood unchanged, yet everything about it now felt defined by the presence of something confirmed but unseen. And in that suspended stillness, Sergeant Daniel Reed understood that the moment of truth was no longer approaching. It had already arrived and was waiting only for the door to acknowledge it. The final silence held for only a fraction longer before it shifted into action, not sudden or chaotic, but controlled and inevitable, as Sergeant Daniel Reed raised his hand in a clear signal for controlled entry procedure to begin. The fog around the warehouse had thinned just enough to reveal the full base of the rusted door, and for the first time the boundary between exterior and interior felt visually complete, as if the environment itself was allowing the moment to proceed. Titan did not move aside. Instead, he remained directly aligned with the seam, his body still anchored in a position of absolute certainty, his eyes fixed forward with unwavering focus. Dr. Emily Carter stepped back into a safer offset position, her attention fully locked on Titan's posture as she prepared to document the transition from containment awareness to confirmed response state. The contractor stood motionless near the perimeter, no longer attempting to influence the situation, his presence reduced to silent observation. Daniel signaled again, and two members of the support team moved forward with controlled precision, positioning themselves at either side of the rusted structure while maintaining strict spacing protocols. Titan did not react to their movement, but he also did not yield his position, remaining centered on the exact point where metal met concrete. Daniel approached slowly, placing himself just behind Titan's left shoulder, his gaze shifting between the dog and the seam, noting that the entire lower edge of the door now showed subtle inconsistencies that suggested internal pressure or recent mechanical interaction. Dr. Carter spoke in a low, steady voice, indicating that Titan's final posture suggested full resolution of detection phase, meaning the stimulus had already been identified and confirmed within his perception framework. Daniel absorbed the information without response, his focus narrowing further as he prepared for the final controlled action. A brief shift in the fog revealed the seam more clearly than before, exposing a narrow dark line that ran uninterrupted along the base of the door. And in that moment Titan's breathing changed slightly, not in intensity, but in rhythm, as if acknowledging that the final stage of observation had been reached. Daniel raised his hand once more, signaling final readiness, and the team responded by securing their positions on either side of the entrance. Titan remained perfectly still, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a quiet reinforcement of alignment that indicated total confirmation without escalation. The contractor looked away entirely now, unable to maintain visual focus on the threshold, while Dr. Carter maintained her position with clinical attention, noting that Titan's gaze no longer tracked variation but held absolute fixation. Daniel stepped slightly closer, placing his hand near the control point of the door mechanism, his movements slow and deliberate, ensuring full coordination with the team behind him. The environment had become so still that even the distant industrial background seemed absent, leaving only the faint movement of fog and the soft sound of controlled breathing. Titan did not move when Daniel reached the mechanism, but he subtly shifted his weight forward by a minimal margin, reinforcing the boundary rather than crossing it. That single adjustment carried the weight of final confirmation, signaling that whatever lay behind the door was no longer uncertain. Daniel paused for one final moment, his hands steady, his posture aligned with protocol and instinct equally. And in that moment, the distinction between observation and resolution disappeared. The warehouse stood unchanged, its rusted surface reflecting faint light through thinning fog, but its silence was no longer neutral. It was defined, contained, and fully acknowledged. Titan remained at the threshold, unyielding, unwavering, and absolute in his certainty. And in that final suspended second, Sergeant Daniel Reed understood that the door no longer represented a barrier of mystery, but a boundary that had already been crossed in every way that mattered except physically, waiting only for the moment when truth would no longer remain hidden behind metal and silence.